The following is a recording of the present and future landscape of paper machine upgrades, originally presented on Thursday, May 29, 2014.
Today we're going to be talking about paper machine upgrades. Let's start with an understanding of why this is important. Understanding the dynamics of paper machine rebuilds or upgrades is important if you're an equipment supplier who sells to the industry, if you are a producer who will face the competitive consequences of future rebuilds and upgrades. If you are a consumer, you will realize the benefits of product improvement that are expected to come from these upgrades and rebuilds and investment in new equipment. Or if you're a financial institution who will provide the capital investment required to fund those upgrades and rebuilds. It's important for everyone in these groups to have an understanding of the dynamics of this part of our business. So today we're going to talk about a few issues. We're going to talk about the significance of rebuilds in the pulp and paper industry. We're going to talk a bit about what drives rebuilds, and then we're going to talk about our ability to forecast rebuilds. First, let's start with a definition. Today I'll use the term rebuild and upgrade interchangeably. For the purposes of our discussion today, a rebuild or an upgrade is some addition or replacement or substantial change on the paper machine. We're not talking about just maintenance or some minor improvements. These are significant changes done to some section of the paper machine. Now, the screenshot is from FisherSolve, and this gives you an idea of how we track rebuilds in FisherSolve. You'll see that this particular paper machine was built in 1957. And for each section of the paper machine, we also have a year built for that section. So here you see that this particular dryer section has the same year built as the installation. So what we know then is that this dryer section has never been rebuilt on this paper machine, its original equipment. But as you can see, every other part of the paper machine has had a rebuild or an upgrade during its lifetime. Now, all of the analysis that I'm going to show you today was done using FisherSolve, which means that you could do this yourself if you're a subscriber. If you would like to pursue this a bit more, I encourage you to reach out to me or to one of the other members of the senior consulting team, and we can walk you through how to do some of this type of analysis. So let's start by examining a profile of rebuilds in our industry. You see here that for most of the last 30 years, rebuilds have significantly outnumbered new machine installations. This blue line, of course, is the number of machines that have been upgraded, and the orange line are new installations. But in recent years, those lines have crossed. That pattern has changed. You'll see that we've been doing more new installations than rebuilds. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is we see this spike in new machine installation in Asia that has happened recently, while at the same time the level of rebuild activity in Asia has drifted slightly lower. But the rest of the world has seen a significant drop in rebuild activity since around 2000, a significant fall off in rebuilds, and at the same time new machine installation drifted slightly lower, but for the most part was relatively flat. Now, most of the rebuilds that have been done in the last 30 years have occurred in Europe. About 45% of the machines that have been, or the rebuilds that have been done on machines that are located in Europe. Now, a comment about this: there are machines that appear in here multiple times, and the reason for that is the way that I pulled this data is I asked FisherSolve to tell me about every time a machine had been rebuilt. So, for instance, if a machine in Europe had the head box rebuilt 20 years ago, and then 10 years ago had a new dryer section, it would appear twice in here. So there are some there's some double counting, but it's important to capture each one of those rebuilds. We also see a difference in where rebuilds are occurring on the paper machines. We know that the majority of rebuilds, in fact about half of the rebuilds that have been done, have happened on the wet end of the paper machine over the last 30 years. And there's also difference in the type of machines that are being rebuilt. More than 40% of the rebuilds that have been done in the past 30 years have been done on machines that make packaging grades. And we also know something about the companies that are doing the rebuilds. And in FisherSolve, we track not only the original equipment supplier, but we track the current supplier. So who installed the equipment originally, and then if it's been rebuilt, who did the rebuild. Now, this view shows us those rebuilds that companies have done on their own equipment. And so we see that Valmet has been very successful selling rebuilds on its own machines. We look at it a different view. We look at those companies who have been successful selling rebuilds to other suppliers' machines. We see that Voith has been the most successful at selling rebuilds to machines that were installed originally by someone else. Now, the share of rebuilds is pretty equally divided globally between Valmet and Voith. Each company has just north of 40% share of the rebuilds that are done, but that does vary a bit across different geographies. So now let's talk about the future of rebuilds, and let's start with a discussion of what drives rebuild activity. Well, the cycle starts with new construction, the installed base of paper machines. So new machines sort of feed the future cycle for rebuild activity. And of course the survival rate of those machines that are installed certainly drives rebuilds. Technology change and the pace of that change has a dramatic impact on rebuilds. Things like dilution control, shoe presses, other types of technological advances that will lower cost, improve quality, or increase productivity, all are things that will increase the rate of rebuilds. Cycles in demand for particular grades will drive rebuilds. As demand for particular grades are declining, you may see less rebuild activity than you would in grades where the demand is increasing. Changes in consumer needs, consumer preferences. For instance, a move towards lighter weight paper and packaging grades will drive the demand for rebuilds. And some macro level things, economic cycles, exchange rates, interest rates, company finances, and I would add to this company attitudes also drive rebuilds. So let's start with that, the notion that rebuilds are driven by the installation of new paper machines. Well, during the first half of the 20th century, we saw some pretty clear peaks in new machine construction every 10 years. I mean, these are very definable peaks in new construction activity, new installation activity. But from about 1970 on, I'm not sure whether the peaks got farther apart or closer together. I suppose one could make an argument for either case. If we look at these significant peaks, it took 40 years to get back to the level of new machine installations at where we were in 1970. But within that 40 years, you do see some peaks that are closer together than they had been in the past. The other thing that I think is interesting about this is the depth of the valleys is a little less significant. They are more shallow than they were in the past, where we would go from installing a lot of machines one year to almost none the next year. That pattern changed over the last 40 years. But of course, not all of those machines that are installed will survive. And so the slides that I just showed you, of course, we broke out between the purple view are those machines that are operating still today, and the orange shaded area shows those machines that have been shut down since they were installed. So the real base, the future of rebuilds, comes from the currently operating machines that are installed globally. There are a little over 6,000 operating paper machines in the world, and about half of those are in Asia. Now, let me take a minute to explain this chart. I mentioned earlier that company attitudes have an impact on rebuild activity. So what we're looking at here is a view of the top 20 paper producers in the world. And the x-axis here shows us the average age, the year installed on average for their paper machines. So think of this as the actual age of their paper machines on average. The y-axis reflects what we call the technical age. Now, technical age in FisherSolve reflects rebuild activity. So this captures those significant improvements and changes that we defined as a rebuild that will serve to make a machine appear and perform younger than it actually is. So if we think about the intersection of these two, we can draw some conclusions about a company's activity and attitude towards rebuild. So this is Smurfit Kappa, and you'll notice that on average, the actual age of their paper machines is about 50 years. On average, their machines are 50 years old. But the average technical age of a Smurfit Kappa machine is only 25 years. So, of course, what that means is that over time, Smurfit Kappa has been pretty active in investing in rebuilds to make their machines younger. And you can draw conclusions about how that compares to some of their competitors. Now, this group of producers over in this lower right-hand corner, these are all Asian producers, and of course this just reflects that these are new machines that have been installed in recent years. So for many years we saw a surge in rebuild activity pretty clearly about every 5 years, pretty distinct peaks every 5 years in rebuild activity. But as we talked about earlier, in recent years we've seen this real sharp decline. I mean, the level of rebuilds just fell off the cliff beginning around 2000 or so. So if we go back and we think about these peaks that were in existence for a number of years, we probably could have drawn a fairly accurate forecast of the next peak by just saying, well, this cycle seems to be pretty regular. We can infer that it's going to repeat itself every 5 years and sort of forecast rebuilds on a macro level. But the world changed here, and this pattern really was erased about 10 or 12 years ago. So that certainly complicates the ability to just do time series forecasting on a macro level for the total volume of rebuilds. So not only has the number of rebuilds declined in recent years, but the percentage of machines that are being rebuilt has changed pretty significantly. So here we're looking at rebuilds, we're looking at information for the last 10 years, the percentage of operating machines that have been rebuilt, actually about the past 11 or 12 years. And we see that in the early 2000s, the industry was rebuilding around 4.5% of the operating machines each year. And we started to see a slight decline and then a pretty sharp decline when the recession began. And we began to drift back upwards, and then we've declined again to where now, globally, the industry is rebuilding just between 1 and 1.5% of the operating machines each year. Now, that does vary by region of the world. So if we go back to 2002, we'll notice that in Latin America, producers were rebuilding more than 10% of the operating machines each year, as compared to just about 2% of machines in North America being rebuilt. But you'll see this pretty steady decline over time to where last year all regions were, I excluded Africa and Middle East because there's just not a lot of activity there, but last year the whole world had settled in around that 1.5% mark of operating machines being rebuilt. So we might look at that and say, gosh, that's kind of depressing. But I actually think there's some good news, because what we see is that there's still a pretty good opportunity for rebuilds. Now, I'll tell you, this surprised me when I looked at this, that half of the operating machines in the world have never been rebuilt. Now, again, I want to make sure that I'm clear. It doesn't mean that they've never had any work done to them. It just means that they haven't had something done that meets the definition of a rebuild for us, no major upgrade to some section of the machine. So more than 50% of the machines in the world have never been rebuilt. And if we look at Asia, that's even a more significant number. 3/4 of the machines in Asia have never had any kind of rebuild performed on them. So let's take a look at this chart for a minute. I think this tells a very interesting story as well. And again, surprised me. I'll be curious to know whether it surprised some of you, that most of the rebuilds on machines that we have seen, now we're just looking at rebuilds on the head box press assembly or formers in this view, but most of those rebuilds have happened on machines in the first 35 years of their life. In fact, about 70% of all the rebuilds that have been done historically have been done on machines that were between 5 and 35 years of age. New machines, of course, aren't likely to be rebuilt because they were just installed, but you'll notice that machines that are pretty young have undergone rebuilds, about 70% in that category. And then as machines start to get a little bit older, producers are less likely to invest in rebuilds. About 20% of the rebuilds that have been done historically have been done on machines that were between 35 and 55 years of age. And I think we can think about this sort of as decision time for producers. At this stage of a machine's life, a company needs to decide whether they want to invest capital in this particular asset, because after that period of time, it seems as if producers may view that they've missed the window of opportunity for rebuilds, because less than 10% of all rebuilds are done on machines that are older than 55 years of age. Not what I expected to see when I started to do this analysis. So, if we're starting to think about how we can forecast or predict which machines are likely to be rebuilt, let's start putting some of those pieces together. So if we look at all of those machines globally that have never been rebuilt, which ones are most likely to be rebuilt? Well, as I mentioned, these ones that are newer, that are less than 5 years old, probably not real likely to be rebuilt today. Of course, as we advance in time, they'll get some age on them and they'll move into the more likely candidate or category of those machines that are between 5 and 35 years of age. And then there's a little less likely, but still somewhat likely chance for those machines that are between 35 and 55 years of age to be rebuilt. But once a machine gets past 55 years of age, it's unlikely that it's going to be a candidate for a rebuild. So again, there are around 3,000 paper machines that have never been rebuilt in the world. And the overwhelming majority of those machines that have never been rebuilt are in Asia. We also know from the data that packaging machines are more than twice as likely to be rebuilt than machines making other grades. Now, that also has changed over time. In 2000, there was a larger gap between packaging and some of the other grades in terms of the percent that were being rebuilt. But last year, still, it's twice as much as the next closest grade and more than that than some of the other grades. So packaging machines are much more likely to be rebuilt than other grades. So again, if we're trying to think about where we would find likely candidates for rebuilds, if we're trying to forecast where those rebuilds are going to occur, who's going to rebuild their machines, we can put those pieces together and we would say that it's likely then that candidates for rebuild would be somewhat newer machines making packaging grades in Asia. And so if we just look at those, we see that there are over 675 machines that meet those criteria. Now again, this category of those that are 5 years or less in age, probably not likely today, but as we move forward in time, of course, this box will shift this way, and we'll have even a larger number that fit into that category. But shouldn't we also consider the health of the machines before investing? If I were a producer, I certainly would consider that. If I were an investor, I would consider that as well. And so let's turn to our Fisher-Saul Benchmark Viability Module to try to get a better understanding of that. So this bubble chart, this is all of those 675 machines that I just told you about, those packaging machines in Asia that have never been rebuilt. Our Benchmark Viability Module measures a machine's risk of failure based on a number of factors, including their competitive cost position, the size or scale of the machine, the age of the machine, and the capital required to keep the machine operating. And so we evaluate those, we weight all of those factors, and we assign a risk index. And 0 is low risk of failure, 10 is high risk of failure. So in this view, we're looking at the y-axis is risk increasing as we go up, and we're also looking here at the age of those machines. So if we kind of divide this graph into quadrants, of course we see the higher risk older machines in the upper right hand quadrant and the lower risk younger machines in the lower left hand quadrant. So if I were trying to predict which of these machines would be most likely to undergo a rebuild, I'd probably focus on these machines that are in this box. Now you could argue that the box needs to be brought this way or up a little bit, but the point is that we can use this information that we know about these machines to determine which of them are most likely to be candidates for investment in a rebuild. But are investments in rebuilds always a good idea? Well, the answer to that is no, they're not. Let me explain what we're looking at here. This is a view of all of the machines that have been shut down since 2002. This is the cumulative percentage of the machines, and this is the years between the last rebuild and the time that they were shut down. Okay? So what we see is that globally, about 25% of the machines that have been shut down since 2002 had undergone a rebuild in the 10 years prior to being shut down. Now that changes a little bit, varies a little bit by region. We see here that European producers actually have been more likely to shut down a machine that had been rebuilt in the relative recent past. So about 35% of the machines that have been shut down in Europe since 2002 had undergone a rebuild in the prior 10 years. Well, that varies at the company level as well. What I did here was I just pulled out one large global producer and plotted them against the rest of the world. And what we see here is that at this particular company, more than 15% of the machines that they shut down since 2002 had been rebuilt in the prior 5 years. Now, there could be and likely are a number of reasons why that would occur. Part of that could come from consolidations. Perhaps this company bought another company, and in the course of consolidation and optimization and rationalization closed a machine that someone else had just recently rebuilt. That's certainly possible. Could be other reasons. But this looks like, and really I guess the effect is, this does have the impact of being destruction of capital. Companies have invested in machines and then in fairly short order turned around and shut them down. Okay, so we talked about some other reasons why machines might be rebuilt, and one of those we talked about were some consumer trends. And let's look at that trend towards light weighting. So here we're looking at the North American linerboard market. Again, this is a cumulative production chart. Shows one company that I picked out against their peer set. And it shows the cumulative production of their tons by the average low basis weight. So this particular company, we see, has 30% of its production capacity that is at 26 pound or lighter. But the rest of the marketplace has over 50% of its capacity that can produce 26 pound or lighter weight linerboard. So it seems reasonable that if this company wants to capitalize and participate in this trend towards lighter basis weights, that the machines that fall in this region of heavier basis weight may be good candidates for rebuild. In fact, it may be required that they be rebuilt if they're going to participate in these lighter basis weights. So let's stick with that theme, but let's broaden it out to the broader market. This is all North American linerboard machines, just those that have been built since 1950. And what I've done is I've plotted the age of the machine, or the year that the machine was built, on the x-axis, and the average low basis weight on the y-axis. And the bubble size, of course, reflects the tons of production. And so I just struck a line here around that 26 pound basis weight area. And so we might be tempted to look at this and say, well, all of the machines that are above this line are on average making basis weights, making heavier than 26 pound basis weights, and so they would be candidates for investment in a rebuild perhaps. But back to this notion of considering whether that's a good idea all the time and considering the risk associated with the machines. So same chart, I've just colored the bubbles differently now to reflect the risk of those individual paper machines using our benchmark viability tool. So these machines that are colored in red, those are high risk machines. The yellow ones are moderate risk and the green ones are low risk. So if I were to look at this and say, okay, so if I want to try to forecast or predict which of these machines would really be candidates, good logical candidates for rebuilds, maybe some of these ones that I've highlighted here would be in the sweet spot, if you will, for rebuild. They're low or moderate risk machines, relatively newer machines, so maybe those would be ones that we would look to and predict that they would be most likely to be rebuilt. One of the other reasons that could drive rebuilds is a productivity issue. Again, we'll stick with North American linerboard machines, and this is a metric that I like to use a lot, and several of my colleagues like to use as well, that we look at productivity in terms of the tons per day per inch of trim on a machine, and we plot that against the width or the trim of the machines. So what we're doing is we're looking at similarly sized machines and comparing their output. So if we strike a line sort of through the middle of this pack, what we could say is that machines that are above this line, let's focus on these machines here, around 250-inch trim machines. These machines are producing a little more than 3 tons per day per inch of trim, while these machines here, these two, are similarly sized but are producing close to 7 tons per day per inch of trim. So these would certainly be leaders in productivity above the line, and the ones below the line we would say are laggards. Well, once again, it would seem logical that if I own these machines down here, I might be interested in increasing the productivity so that I can become more competitive perhaps. But the thing to keep in mind is that as we do that, as we increase the productivity of those machines, what's going to happen is we're going to get capacity creep, right? So if these machines go from making 3 tons a day to making 5 tons a day, I've just increased the supply of the products in my marketplace. Well, that may not always be a good idea, and in fact, certainly some companies would have less of an incentive to want to invest in those type of rebuilds than others. And we can see that. Again, same chart, but now I've colored the bubbles just by the company who owns the machine. So all these green machines are owned by the same company. So if I own these green machines down here, do I have the same incentive to increase the productivity and increase the supply of product in my marketplace? Perhaps not. But if I'm this guy and I own one of these three machines, I don't have any machines that are productivity leaders. All of my machines are lagging behind. And so I have much more of an incentive to get above the line, and I'm willing to accept perhaps the consequences that might come from increased supply of product in my marketplace. So again, we can draw conclusions that these machines would be more likely to be rebuilt than others in that category. Okay, so what we've seen is that rebuild cycles are driven by a number of factors. Starts with the number of new machines that are installed on an annual basis. It's also driven by technological advancements that we see. Economic conditions certainly impact the number of rebuilds. Grade health, as we discussed. Company attitude, companies' willingness to invest in rebuilds, and their ability to invest in rebuilds certainly affect how many of those done, how many get done. And we also know that forecasting macro rebuild cycles is very complex. If we had gone back in that earlier chart that I showed you 20 years, we probably would have been comfortable forecasting a continuation of those peaks. But we would have been wrong about that. And so if we look at the totality of conditions, forecasting these rebuilds at the macro level is a complex endeavor. Now, we haven't gotten there yet, but I can tell you we're working hard at it. This is something that over the last couple of months we've spent a fair amount of time thinking about and studying at Fisher, and that doesn't stop today. In fact, I'm more inspired to continue that work after I've seen some of these conclusions that we've drawn from this. So we'll continue to work towards building a model that gives us a broader view of rebuild activity. But I think it's important also to understand, though, and maybe it's more important to understand not how many rebuilds are going to be done globally, but who's going to do the rebuild and maybe when they might do it. So predicting which machines are most likely to be rebuilt is something that we've shown we can do, and of course that's aided by good intelligence like we just saw from FisherSolve.